The veteran's hands did not shake when he pulled the folded cotton from his pack. Not from fear, from the cold. The fabric was clean. He held it out to the replacement standing beside him in the shell crater. A kid from Omsk, maybe 17 years old, still with that farm boy shine in his eyes. The boy looked at the underwear like it was some kind of joke. "Before we go over," the veteran said, "you put these on. Clean pair. Every time." The kid laughed, nervous energy looking for somewhere to go. The veteran's boot caught him in the chest. The kid hit the frozen ground hard. "A bullet tears through you. It takes whatever fabric it touches along with it. Dirty cloth, boy, that gets pulled into the wound. Bacteria feast on torn tissue. No sulfa, no medic, just you and the rot." The veteran's voice carried the weight of Stalingrad, of Kursk, of watching too many good men die from something as simple as dirty underwear. Infection kills you slower than a bullet, much slower. I have watched men scream for 4 days from a gut shot that should have killed them in 4 minutes. Because their drawers were filthy. The laughter died. "Strip," the veteran said. "All of you." 43 pale bodies shivering in the February cold. The veteran walked the line. He stopped at a boy with black-crusted shorts that had not seen water in 3 weeks, standard for the front. "You see that pile of bodies over there?" He pointed through the artillery smoke to where yesterday's assault had finished. Every one of those men thought the underwear rule was a joke, too. Nobody laughed after that. This was the Eastern Front in 1943. And the clean underwear rule was just the beginning of an education that no military academy had ever taught, and no official manual would ever print. It was an education written entirely in blood, paid for with mass graves, and passed from survivor to survivor in the quiet moments between the killing. The Red Army of 1941 was not an army, that is, not an insult. It is simply what the evidence shows. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June of that year, they did not find a fighting force on the other side of the border. They found a catastrophe waiting to happen. The problems ran deeper than anyone in Moscow wanted to admit. Stalin's purges had gutted the officer corps in the late 1930s, removing almost every experienced commander above the rank of colonel. The men who replaced them were politically reliable, which in Soviet terms meant they were the men who had survived by keeping their mouths shut and following instructions. They arrived at the front with clean uniforms, unmarked maps, and an absolute faith in doctrine that had never once been tested by an angry German. The enlisted men were worse off in different ways. The Soviet Union was enormous and diverse in ways that pure geography cannot capture. A typical rifle company in 1941 might contain Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians, and Armenians. Half of them had never heard a word of Russian before conscription. The other half spoke it as a distant second language, adequate for buying bread at a market in Moscow, but completely useless when German mortars were walking across your position and a sergeant was screaming coordinates into a field telephone. Picture the chaos. A Georgian sergeant trying to coordinate an attack with Siberian conscripts who cannot understand his commands. Uzbek soldiers receiving orders through 3 layers of broken translation, while German artillery cuts the position apart. Entire battalions moving in wrong directions, not because of cowardice, but because nobody could make sense of what was being asked of them. The Wehrmacht looked at Soviet tactics and saw amateur hour. They were not wrong. One German intelligence officer noted that Soviet units fought, in his words, like deaf mutes. Signals that should have coordinated flanking movements produced random surges in wrong directions. Fire support. Requests went unanswered because the men with the radios could not communicate with the men calling the fire. Political officers solved communication breakdowns by standing behind retreating soldiers with pistols, which addressed the symptom and not the disease, and added a layer of lethal confusion that made everything worse. The Germans exploited this mercilessly. They had studied combined arms warfare against opponents who spoke one language and shared one doctrine. Against opponents who could not reliably transmit a fire mission or confirm a withdrawal order, German machine gun teams achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible to anyone who had not witnessed them personally. Senior Lieutenant Kozlov remembered his first action near Smolensk. His company included 1,000 men who prayed in languages he had never heard, who were organized by a doctrine designed for an army that did not actually exist. When the German MG42 opened up, his men did exactly what untrained men do. Under fire, they bunched together, they sought comfort in proximity. And the machine gun, which fires 1,200 rounds per minute, made short work of targets that had helpfully clustered themselves together. The MG42 became the defining sound of the Eastern Front. Veterans learned to identify it by ear alone, not by sight. By the time you saw an MG42, you were already in its kill zone. The sound was distinctive. Not the measured crack of a bolt-action rifle or the stutter of a submachine gun. The MG42 sounded like canvas being ripped by a giant, loud enough to shake the earth, fast enough to cut a man in half before he could register the noise. Soviet doctrine had an answer for this. The answer was more men, wave attacks, human sea tactics. The first wave goes forward and draws fire. The second wave flanks left. The third wave exploits the breakthrough. It was logical on paper. It assumed the first wave would actually draw fire effectively and that the machine gun crews would run out of ammunition before the third wave arrived. What it did not account for was the fact that German machine gun nests were never isolated. They were part of systems, interlocking fields of fire designed so that attacking one position brought fire from 3 others. And the Germans had ammunition to spare. Obergefreiter Müller sat behind an MG42 position in the autumn of 1941 and watched Soviet infantry advance toward him in perfect textbook formation. Proper spacing, regulation speed, maintaining unit cohesion exactly as doctrine prescribed. His loader did not even need to traverse. Müller held the trigger and let physics do the work. He counted 17 bodies in the first burst. The second wave came forward over the corpses of the first, maintaining its formation, and he did it again. "They never learn," he told his loader. "Same approach every time, like they want to die." He was wrong about one thing. Some of them were learning, the survivors, the ones who had watched. This happened 3 or 4 times and were no longer willing to simply walk into the killing zone because an officer with clean boots told them to. Viktor Astafev served as a combat analyst throughout the war and survived long enough to write honestly about what he had witnessed. His assessment became famous among historians decades later for its bluntness. "We simply did not know how to fight," he wrote. "We finished the war without knowing how to fight. We poured out our blood and threw back the enemy with our bodies." But bodies were not enough, not at first, and the bodies began to accumulate in numbers that defied comprehension. 2 million Soviet dead in 1941 alone, another million in 1942. The front was not a line, it was a wound that would not close. And somewhere in that wound, the survivors began to learn. Senior Sergeant Volkov had been fighting since Barbarossa. By 1943, he had survived long enough to recognize the veterans when he saw them. They moved differently. Not faster, not slower, differently. The way they checked corners, the way they instinctively sought ground that offered real cover rather than the illusion of it. The way they never, under any circumstances, trusted the manual. When a new batch of replacements arrived, Volkov pulled them aside before their first officer could reach them. "Clean underwear before every attack," he said. "That is the first rule. Write it on your hand if you have to. Before you go over the top, you change into the cleanest pair you have." A replacement from a Moscow military academy raised his hand. Academy graduate. Literate. Thought he understood war because he had read about it. Comrade Sergeant, regulations don't specify personal hygiene as a pre-combat requirement. Volkov stared at him for a long time. How many rivers have you crossed under fire? He asked. The boy said nothing. Dirty fabric gets pulled into the wound by the bullet. Bacteria live in that fabric. When the fabric enters the wound cavity, the bacteria go with it. Gangrene starts in the wound, not from the bullet. The bullet just opens the door. It is the filth that kills you. Volkov lit a cigarette. The commissars don't teach this. The commissars don't get shot. This was the essential tension of the entire Eastern Front War for Soviet forces. Not the gap between courage and cowardice. The gap between experience and doctrine. Between the men who had been through the killing and the men who had studied the killing from a comfortable distance and arrived with absolute certainty about how it was supposed to work. The academy officers kept dying. Not always gloriously, often stupidly, leading textbook assaults against positions that demanded improvisation, following regulations in situations that demanded pragmatism, insisting on unit cohesion while unit cohesion was being measured in body parts scattered across 60 meters of churned earth. The veterans kept surviving. And with each week that passed, with each batch of replacements that arrived, and each officer that died following regulations, the balance shifted slightly. The survivors began teaching, quietly, away from commissars and political officers and anyone who might describe what they were saying as defeatist thinking. The legs in the hole technique emerged from the artillery hell of 1942 and spread through the ranks in exactly this way. No official endorsement. No manual entry. Pure survivor knowledge passed between the men who had lived through enough barrages to understand the geometry of the problem. Standard artillery doctrine told soldiers to lie flat in their trenches during a bombardment. Present the smallest possible profile. Return fire immediately when the artillery lifted. It was sensible advice as far as it went, which was not very far when you understood how high explosive shells actually worked. Senior Sergeant Petrov demonstrated it to a group of replacements using a piece of wood and a handful of dirt. Shell lands, he said, pushing the wood into the ground at an angle. Blast goes up and out. Standard firing position, you are lying flat on the firing step. The fragments travel horizontally across your position. They find you. He paused. Now sit here instead. He dropped into the deeper section of the trench, the drainage sump where rainwater collected. Legs dangling down into the lowest point, body protected by the earth walls. Only head and shoulders above ground level. Tank rolls over your position? Your legs are in the hole. The tread passes above you. Shell lands nearby. The blast goes over your head. Your vital organs are below ground level. You can still observe. You can still shoot. But you are not lying flat on a horizontal surface while blast fragments travel horizontally. One of the replacements raised his hand. Comrade Sergeant, the manual specifies that soldiers maintain firing positions during enemy bombardment and return fire immediately when the artillery lifts. Petrov stared at him with the expression of a man who has already attended too many funerals. The manual was written by men who had never been shelled, he said. You want to follow it? Stand on the firing step during the next barrage. See how long you last. The demonstration ended when German artillery started ranging their position. The veterans dropped into the sumps. The replacements hesitated. The first shell landed 50 meters away. Close enough. The replacements dove into the sumps without anyone having to explain anything further. 20 minutes of heavy bombardment. 105mm and 150mm rounds walking across their sector. The kind of barrage that turned trenches into mass graves. When it lifted, 2 replacements were wounded by shell fragments. Not fatal. Nothing that would keep them from fighting. The veterans climbed back to the firing step, checked their weapons, and said nothing. The replacements understood. No further explanation was necessary. The Legs in the hole technique spread through the Red Army the way all genuine survival knowledge spreads. Person to person. Batch to batch. Despite official indifference and occasional official disapproval. Because it worked. Because staying alive mattered more than looking disciplined. But the single most concentrated lesson in the cost of following Doctrine came not from a trench or a bombardment. It came from a river, September 1943. The Dnieper. The Germans called their defensive line on the western bank the East Wall. The Soviets called the islands and sandbars where the crossing forces tried to establish footholds something else entirely. The Island of Death. Mansur Abdulin crouched in a shell crater on the eastern bank with his assault partner Shamrai and watched the first wave load into boats. They were fresh troops mostly, farm boys and factory workers who had received 6 weeks of training and a rifle that half of them did not know how to clean. They were loading into those boats the way Academy Doctrine prescribed. Organized, proper spacing, maintaining unit cohesion, following the manual for amphibious assault operations. The German artillery positions on the western bank had been registered on these crossing points for months. Every approach was mapped, every landing site was pre-sighted. The machine gun nests were positioned to create crossfires at the exact locations where assault boats would be most exposed. The mortar crews had range cards that eliminated the need for adjustment fire. The first wave launched at dawn, perfect visibility for the defenders. The boats headed straight across in proper formation. The German artillery opened up when they reached midstream. The first salvo was ranging fire. The second was for effect. Abdulin watched boats capsize, men screaming in the current in full equipment, survivors trying to swim while weighted down with ammunition and rifles, bodies floating face down. The ones who made it to the far bank ran straight up the beach following Doctrine, maintaining momentum, pressing the attack directly into machine gun positions that had been waiting for them since before sunrise. The second wave launched before the scale of the disaster was fully understood. Same formation, same approach, same result. They're sending them to the same place, Shamrai said, his voice flat. Germans have every meter of that shoreline registered. By noon, the river was clogged with bodies. Soviet engineers tried to build bridges. German artillery destroyed them before they could be completed. The crossing force that had numbered 3,000 men by morning existed only on paper by evening. Abdulin and Shamrai were veterans. They had survived long enough to develop their own crossing technique through trial and error across multiple river operations, and that technique violated every principle in the Assault Doctrine manual. They crossed at night, single boats, no lights, no organization, navigation, by compass and instinct. They landed 300 meters downstream from the designated assault beaches, away from the pre-sighted killing zones, away from the registered mortar targets, in shallows that no tactical planner had bothered to map, because no tactical planner would consider them viable for organized assault operations. They were not conducting organized assault operations. They were two men moving through darkness toward a German position that had been slaughtering Soviet forces all day. They found the communication trench at 2300. Shamrai cut the wire while Abdulin handled the machine gun crew at the first bunker. Close work. Ugly work. The kind that does not appear in heroic accounts. By 700, with 7 other survivors who had used similar unconventional crossings, they had eliminated the position using techniques that existed nowhere in any official document. 9 men accomplished what 3,000 had failed to do in 12 hours. No writer could ever describe what we saw there, Abdulin said later, speaking of the river crossing in general, of the bodies and the oil slicks and the sounds that carried across water in the dark. He was right. The official histories would describe the Dnieper crossing as a heroic achievement of Soviet arms. The veterans knew what it had actually cost. The lesson from the Dnieper was the same lesson the clean underwear rule was trying to teach. just written larger. Doctrine was written by men who had never tested it. Experience was the only teacher that mattered. And the tuition for that education was measured in dead men. The Germans were learning their own version of the same lesson, just under different conditions. The winter of 1943 hit the 6th Panzer Division like a physical assault. Not from enemy action, from weather. Minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turned spit into ice before it hit the ground. The kind that froze rifle action solid and made trigger discipline a matter of whether your fingers would still bend. The division was losing 800 men per day to frostbite. Not combat casualties. Not wounds. Just cold. The ground was frozen so hard that standard entrenching tools bounced off the surface without making a dent. Men were standing guard duty in exposed positions until they collapsed from hypothermia, replaced by other men who would collapse in turn. Traditional defensive doctrine required trenches. The earth would not cooperate. Hauptmann Müller commanded the engineer company. He watched his troops freeze in their positions and understood that regulations about the proper use of explosive supplies were about to become irrelevant. "Bring up everything we have," he told his sergeant. "Shaped charges, Bangalore torpedoes, everything." The sergeant looked at the frozen landscape and understood immediately. "The ground, sir." The ground. The first demolition created a crater 15 feet across and 6 feet deep, large enough for a squad, protected from wind, below direct fire angle, wide enough for weapons and equipment. They worked through the night, controlled detonations blasting crater lines in the frozen earth, connecting them with communication trenches, creating an entire defensive sector that manual labor could not have produced in 2 weeks. The division commander arrived to inspect the positions the following morning. He walked through the crater line with professional interest, noting the irregular construction, the non-standard dimensions, the wasteful consumption of explosive supplies that were officially designated for combat missions only. 0 frostbite casualties after completion. Full combat readiness restored. A defensive network that could withstand direct assault built in a single night. Higher headquarters initially objected. Improper use of resources. Unauthorized modification of doctrine. The same bureaucratic friction that greeted every genuine innovation on both sides of the line. But dead men were harder to argue against than regulations, and the frostbite numbers were unambiguous. Within weeks, the technique was official policy. Engineer units began carrying demolition supplies specifically designated for winter excavation. Field innovation became standard procedure. But the Americans were about to demonstrate that the same failure mode could reproduce itself even in armies that had studied the lessons of the Eastern Front. The Orscholz Switch Line. Winter 1944. A German defensive position built into the Siegfried Line with the kind of engineering that makes military historians nervous. Concrete bunkers. Anti-tank guns. Infantry strongpoints connected by communication trenches. Interlocking fields of fire covering every viable approach. The kind of position that existed for one purpose only, which was to make coordinated assault as expensive as possible. Colonel Harrison commanded the Tiger Division. Heavy armor, experienced crews, combat-tested tactics, and an absolute certainty, born of success in open country warfare, that tanks could handle this alone. The 90th Infantry Division was positioned nearby. Combat veterans who understood how to clear bunkers, coordinate with armor, reduce fortified positions without catastrophic casualties. Standard combined arms doctrine was explicit on the subject. This was a job for tanks and infantry working together. Harrison refused the support. "This is a tank mission," he told his operations officer. "We punch through with armor, follow up with exploitation." Major Williams had served in North Africa and Sicily. He had seen what happened when armor attacked prepared positions without infantry. He raised his concerns carefully, professionally, knowing that the colonel held command and that questioning doctrine too directly had its own consequences. Harrison overruled him. The attack went forward. Tanks advancing across open ground into anti-tank killing zones. No infantry support. No artillery. Preparation. No smoke. Textbook execution of the wrong doctrine applied to the wrong tactical situation. The German 88mm guns were positioned in defilade, protected by concrete, invisible until they fired. The first salvo destroyed 3 Sherman tanks before the formation had traveled 200 meters. Direct hits to ammunition storage. Secondary explosions that lit the battlefield like daylight. The surviving tanks pressed forward, following Doctrine, maintaining momentum, because the manual said to maintain momentum. More tanks died. The 88mm gun was purpose-built to destroy tank frontal armor at distances where American main guns could not effectively return fire. The mathematics were not favorable. Harrison ordered a second attack. Same approach. More casualties. No progress. The third attack repeated the results of the first 2. By the end of 3 days, the Tiger Division had lost 60% of its armor. The Orscheltz line remained intact and fully operational. Harrison was relieved of command. The 90th Infantry Division subsequently reduced the position through combined arms assault, tank infantry coordination, proper artillery preparation, and systematic reduction of defensive strongpoints. It took them 6 hours to accomplish what 3 days of pure armor doctrine had completely failed to do. The lesson was the same lesson Volkov had been teaching in shell craters since 1942. Doctrine was a starting point, not a destination. Adaptation beat adherence when survival was at stake, and sometimes the manual was simply wrong. Lieutenant Collins had already learned this by the time he found himself staring at a dug-in Panther through his periscope. 75 tons of German engineering, thick armor, high-velocity gun, positioned hull down with only the gun mantlet visible above the earth berm. The kind of defensive position that training manuals specifically identified as requiring coordinated attack, multiple tanks, infantry support, artillery preparation. Collins had none of these things. He had 1 Sherman, 1 crew, 36 rounds, and a target that could kill him at 1,200 meters. Single tank versus prepared position, his gunner observed. Doctrine says don't. Doctrine also said Harrison would break through, Collins replied. The approach was aggressive to the point of appearing irrational. Collins laid smoke on the move, closing the range under cover of white phosphorus clouds. The Panther engaged at maximum range, high-velocity rounds screaming, passed close enough to feel the shock wave. The German gunner was professional. He was also confused because Doctrine said that a single tank under these conditions would either retreat or wait for support. It would not close range through its own smokescreen toward a superior weapon system. Collins did not retreat. He closed to 400 meters, stopped, and engaged the gun mantlet directly. First shot miss. Second, sparks off the turret face. Sparks. Third, possible damage to the elevation mechanism. The German gun tube elevated slightly. Return fire became less precise. Fourth shot. Armor-piercing round into the joint between turret and hull. Secondary explosion inside the fighting compartment. The Panther gun tube dropped. No further return fire. Collins reversed his Sherman out of the engagement zone. Crew intact. Position neutralized. The tactical outcome that Doctrine said was impossible. The honest explanation was not genius. It was desperation applied intelligently. Collins understood the situation well enough to know that waiting for proper support meant waiting for the German crew to range him precisely and fire a killing shot. Aggressive forward action was risky, but passive waiting was certain death. He chose the risk. The lesson traveled through American armor units. Doctrine was a guide. When Doctrine's assumptions no longer matched the tactical situation, Doctrine became a liability. The men who understood this survived. The men who did not became statistics in after-action reports. By 1944, the Red Army was something that would have been unrecognizable to the force that had stumbled backward through Barbarossa 3 years earlier. Same uniforms, same weapons, different animal. The transformation was not the result of better equipment, though Soviet industry had eventually outproduced German factories. It was not the result of better initial training, because that training had been catastrophically inadequate from the beginning. It was the result of survival selection on an industrial scale. 3 years of continuous warfare had killed every soldier who could not adapt and promoted every soldier who could. What remained was something that German intelligence reports described, with visible anxiety, as tactically competent and professionally dangerous. The veterans had become teachers. Senior Sergeant Dmitry stood before replacement officers in a shell crater that served as a classroom and said the same thing Volkov had been saying for 3 years, that Kozlov had been saying, that Abdulin had been saying. Forget what they taught you. This is how you stay alive. Clean underwear before every attack. Dirty fabric enters the wound with the bullet and breeds infection that kills slower and worse than any piece of metal. Change into clean cotton before you go over the top. Every time, without exception. Legs in the hole during bombardment. The blast goes up and out. Your vital organs below ground level means you survive what would otherwise kill you. Sitting on the firing step during a barrage is how you become a casualty. Sitting in the sump is how you live to be a veteran. Cross rivers at night. Away from the registered sites. In small groups or alone if necessary. The manual says organized waves. The manual also says the Dnieper crossing is viable. The bodies in the river say otherwise. Attack from unexpected directions. Not because the manual is wrong about surprise. The manual understands surprise well enough, because surprise means something more specific than arriving at the designated attack time from the designated attack direction with the designated formation spacing. Surprise means doing what the German machine gunners have not pre-sighted their weapons to counter. Make that determination based on what you can see, not based on what the attack order says. These were not complicated ideas. They were not the product of military genius. They were the product of watching enough friends die from preventable mistakes and being unwilling to watch any more of it. The academy officers called this kind of thinking undisciplined. The veterans called it survival. The German perspective on this transformation was captured in field reports that grew progressively more concerned through 1943 and into 1944. Early reports described Soviet tactics with contempt, mass charges, poor coordination, predictable patterns. By late 1943, the tone had changed. Soviet forces demonstrate increased tactical flexibility, one report noted. Previous assessment of attack methods no longer reliable. Enemy forces are learning. Obergefreiter Müller, who had manned his MG42 through hundreds of Soviet attacks, put it more directly in a letter home. They are not the same soldiers we faced in 1941, he wrote. They move differently now. They are starting to fight like us. He meant it as a professional observation, not a compliment. Though it was both. The transformation that Astafev had described so honestly, the confession that they simply did not know how to fight, was becoming less true with every passing month. Not because the Soviet system had improved its training programs or because Stalin had suddenly developed useful opinions about tactical doctrine. Because the survivors had figured it out through the only method that actually works at scale, which is paying for every lesson in blood and remembering what you paid for. The Dnieper veterans had learned that standard river crossing doctrine was a blueprint for mass casualties. They taught the next group of replacements how to cross rivers without dying. The bombardment survivors had learned that lying flat on the firing step during artillery was a death sentence. They taught the legs in the hole technique to every new batch of conscripts. The men who had watched 40 comrades die from infected gut wounds because of dirty underwear had taught the clean underwear rule, and it had spread through the entire army despite never appearing in a single official document. This was how armies actually learned, not from revised manuals, not from new doctrine issued by staff officers in Moscow, from veterans talking to replacements in the hours between fighting, from scars and missing fingers, and the particular way a man moves when he has been through enough to understand what actually matters. The clean underwear rule was the beginning of this curriculum because it captured the essential lesson perfectly. Details matter. The things that seem small enough to ignore are exactly the things that get you killed. The bullet is not the only danger. The infection is not a secondary concern. Everything connects. The man who changes his underwear before an attack and survives his gut wound to fight again is worth more than 10 men who followed every regulation and died screaming 4 days after taking a round through the stomach. Shamrai died 2 weeks after the Dnieper crossing. Sniper bullet while crossing open ground. Abdulin survived until Berlin, carrying the knowledge of every man they had crossed rivers with, and every technique they had developed together. And he never forgot what that knowledge had cost. Volkov was still teaching replacements in 1945, still starting with the same lesson he had started with in 1942. Clean underwear before every attack, not because your mother told you, because a bullet drags whatever it touches into the wound, and infection kills slower and worse than metal. And you want to give yourself every possible chance of surviving long enough to teach the man next to you what you know. The Red Army that crossed into Germany in 1945 was built on the bones of the one that had retreated from the border in 1941. Same organization, different people in every sense that mattered. The survivors had become the backbone. The veterans who had paid for their education with 3 years of blood and had graduated from the only school that offers a real degree in staying alive. Viktor Astafev's words stayed with every one of them. The honest confession of a man who had watched the whole thing from close enough to see clearly. We simply did not know how to fight. We finished the war without knowing how to fight. We poured out our blood and threw back the enemy with our bodies. The veterans understood the difference between that statement and what was actually true by war's end. They had not finished the war without knowing how to fight. They had learned. They had learned with their own blood, which is the most expensive education available and the only one that cannot be faked. The clean underwear rule, the legs in the hole, the night river crossing, the single tank that had no right to win, the crater lines blasted from frozen earth. All of it purchased the same way. All of it remembered by the men who survived to remember it. All of it passed forward in whispers to the next generation of men who were about to find out what the manuals had forgotten to include. The price of ignorance on the Eastern Front was measured in millions. The price of knowledge was measured the same way. The difference was that the knowledge, once bought, could be passed on. The ignorance had to be paid for fresh every time. That was the real lesson of the clean underwear rule. Not hygiene, not battlefield medicine. The lesson that small things were never small. That the details you ignored were the details that killed you. That survival required paying attention to everything the Doctrine told you was not worth worrying about. Because the men who wrote the Doctrine had never been shot at, and the men who had been shot at had learned things that no classroom could contain. The Eastern Front was the most expensive school in human history. The curriculum was written in shell craters